Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy's webinar, Before Disasters Strike, Rethinking Philanthropy for a Changing Climate. Um, my name is Sharad Aggarwal. I'm the Vice President for Fund Management and Coalition Building at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. I use my pronouns he, him. And in my work, working with our fund managers and our coalition builders, we're already seeing how many of our community level actors are already addressing and responding to the changing landscape that's been caused by climate change. So looking forward to kind of delving in further in terms of what the philanthropic response can also be. Um, we have a few housekeeping notes to share with you as you complete the poll that should be on your screen. There is live captioning available now via Zoom. If you click on the closed caption live transcript button at the bottom to access it, it's available in a multiple number of languages. And we're recording this webinar. It may be available on our website and on our YouTube channel later on. You can also submit questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer them at the end of the panel discussion. So we have a few kind of introductory remarks for myself before we cover the kind of results to the poll and then get into our deeper discussion with our amazing panel of guests. So as we start the webinar, we approach the conversation grounded in CDP's mission to mobilize philanthropic support for communities who are the least resourced and most impacted by disasters. In 2024 alone, climate-related disasters displaced a record 45.8 million people. 3 in every 4 refugees or people displaced by conflict are currently living in countries facing high to extreme exposure to climate-related hazards. By 2040, the number of countries facing extreme climate hazards could rise from 3 to 65. We have heard from partners about the strain these events have placed on communities around the world, with historic drought in East Africa, rain and flooding in the aftermath of wildfires in Hawaii and Georgia, extreme heat and wildfires around the US, Canada, and Europe this summer, to name just a few examples. And as we're seeing in the last couple of weeks, extreme flooding in locations like Bangladesh. Climate change is not only driving an increase in the frequency and scope of disasters, but also leading to additional economic, social, and political pressures that exacerbate existing inequities among those whom society has already made most vulnerable. By the end of the webinar, we hope that you will understand why proactive and anticipatory approaches are essential for addressing climate-related disasters. And also learn more about practical philanthropic approaches that support community adaptation and resilience. So we have some early returns on our poll results. So quite an interesting mix of participants, about a quarter from philanthropic or grant-making institutions, well over half from nonprofit or non-governmental institutions, and then a mix of academic, multilateral, governmental, and private sector partners. No one from the other category. And then in terms of current approaches to climate-related disasters, an even more interesting kind of spread. Probably the most prominent one is actively prioritizing climate-informed approaches, which is great to kind of see and hear. And then also interesting, about 12% of you not sure and still learning. So we're really hoping that this session will start that learning journey and help to kind of inform funders on more climate-informed approaches. Thank you for responding to that survey. At CDP, a lot of our work is related to kind of looking at where the funding flows as one metric for how philanthropy does kind of resource and shift resources and power to communities affected by disasters. So one of our guests today, the Climate Works Foundation, they have some excellent resources available. And there's a quick snapshot you'll see on your screen now of the philanthropic funding for climate-informed approaches. So according to ClimateWorks Foundation's most recent data, foundation funding for climate adaptation has more than doubled since 2021, totaling an estimated 870 million in 2024. And CDP's own work through its State of Disaster Philanthropy report found that the larger share of disaster assistance went towards immediate response and relief. And however, just 6% of funding was going to resilience, risk reduction, and mitigation, and even less towards preparedness. So as we see, funding is being channeled towards these approaches, but in a manner that there seem to be a lot of gaps and opportunity for further investment in both climate adaptation and general resilience, risk mitigation, and preparedness approaches. We'll be covering those topics a lot today, so some terminology that is good to kind of set the groundwork for. So especially in terms of the proactive approaches towards climate-driven disasters. So a few terms that we'll kind of mention here and that'll also be dropped into the chat so you can refer to them later. Anticipatory action, taking steps before a forecasted hazard or crisis occurs to reduce its potential impacts on people, communities, and livelihoods. Adaptation, which is adjusting systems, policies, infrastructure, and practices to reduce vulnerability and build resilience to current and future risks. Mitigation, taking measures to reduce the likelihood, severity, or underlying drivers of hazards and disasters. And then preparedness, building plans, capacities, resources, and partnerships in advance so communities can respond effectively when disasters do occur. So hopefully that'll provide some kind of good points of reference as we kind of build our conversation today. And now to introduce our wonderful guests that have amazing insights and expertise that they're sharing with us today. First is Scott Onder, who is the Chief Investment and Innovation Officer at Mercy Corps, where he leads the agency's global strategy for impact investing, innovation, climate tech, and strategic partnerships with emerging technology ventures. Scott is also the co-founder and managing partner of Mercy Corps Ventures, MCV, the venture capital arm of Mercy Corps, which invests in high-impact startups developing inclusive fintech, climate resilience, and Web3 solutions in frontier markets. Thank you, Scott, for joining us, and welcome to your Mercy Corps colleagues, too. Jessica Hitt is the Senior Associate Director of the Adaptation and Resilience Program at ClimateWorks Foundation, where she focuses on mobilizing philanthropy to fund adaptation initiatives as well as growing ClimateWorks adaptation strategy. With over 15 years of experience in climate adaptation, Jessica brings a wealth of expertise in assessing climate risks and vulnerabilities, prioritizing adaptation strategies, and building capacity to address climate impacts. Welcome, Jessica and ClimateWorks colleagues. Greg Pulley is the chief of the Climate and Innovation section at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, also known as OCHA. The Climate and Innovation section is responsible for guiding OCHA's response to the climate crisis, including its anticipatory action portfolio and its engagement with climate finance mechanisms. Greg has had a long career of both program management and policy development in the humanitarian sphere in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Welcome, Greg. Really looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you. So kicking off our discussion, at CDP, we advocate that funders shift from reactive responses to proactive approaches before disasters strike. Jess, I'll ask you to comment first. I know you were recently at London Climate Week, a really busy week. What did funders share about their challenges in moving to more anticipatory and adaptation-focused funding? And how is that shaping your thinking about what's needed to shift strategies? Over to you, Jess.
Yes, thank you. Wow, London feels like a little bit of a lifetime ago. but it was a wonderful week. And I think maybe first and foremost, it was really great to see adaptation and resilience kind of get the airtime in a space like London Climate Action Week. It honestly felt like it was the first time this topic had kind of that level of platform. I've been going to these climate weeks for a few years, and this felt a little bit like a step change in the conversation. But as far as kind of what I was hearing, and I think from funders across the board, everyone's really wrestling with the same question of how to effectively support communities impacted by climate change. And there was some digging into like what are the right modalities, how do we each start to play a part that's right sized for our existing portfolios, and looking ahead kind of what does this mean for our work moving forward? How might we change or adapt our own kind of internal workings to better meet the moment. And there were a few themes as well. Adaptation finance, of course, is always a hot topic. But I think what struck me this go around in this kind of climate week was it felt a bit more advanced, and in some cases, some of the conversations felt genuinely tactical. I think like the two big buckets of challenges I think I kept hearing again and again was around lots around kind of the access to financing, which I think is, perennial issue. And there were some really good tactical conversations around how we take pilots and scale them into something larger that's more sustained over time. And I think kind of those two different challenges kind of showed up a little bit differently depending on who was in the room. So I think with some of our private sector funders, we kept kind of coming back to the challenge of the longer time horizons and mechanisms that are really more built for purpose for pricing risk over 5 or less years, and that doesn't match up with kind of a lot of the uncertain timescales of climate disasters. And from philanthropy, I was thinking back, and I think there's a lot of talk and growing interest in scalable disaster risk reduction and how we identify the promising projects that are actually reducing future risk and how we get them again past that pilot stage into something kind of more long term. I think cities also played a big role kind of in the London Climate Action Week conversation, and their critical role in responding to climate change, adaptation and resilience, but also including disasters. And the tension there, I think that kept coming up was, the climate finance mechanisms might not be fit for purpose as they don't, where the money sits and kind of where those responsible for the action is not kind of right sized. And then in thinking, I guess, a bit about like how we're shifting and kind of responding to, the lessons and conversations we heard, our funding focuses exclusively on the global south and kind of recognizes the region most impacted by climate with the least responsibility for causing it. And I think given that those highlights of kind of how finance stalls before it reaches communities on the front lines, we're prioritizing kind of locally led efforts and resilience building at the city level. So looking to kind of look at those mechanisms, both the finance getting to the city as well as capacitating and resourcing those on the ground and trying to put resources closer to where the impacts are actually happening and where we know we need more input and decision making. And I think in addition to that, I think one thing we're already doing, but I think, we'll continue to do is move beyond grant making alone, pairing our grant making with mechanisms that test new models for the system itself. One example being parametric heat insurance, which pays out automatically. So rather than that kind of lengthy loss assessment process, getting communities resources faster after a disaster happens. And I think one thing that I find interesting about this work is we're kind of doing this in a learning environment with other funders through ARC, or the Adaptation and Resilience Collaborative for Funders, which is a kind of a loose affiliation or convening of around 70 funders that kind of work across climate, health, food, myriad topics. And the purpose is really to kind of create a shared space to align on that. So if they're investing in parametric and insurance and we are, what are we seeing? How can we get better and more effectively approach this together? And many of the questions kind of we're thinking about today kind of are really part of our regular discourse and shared agenda to kind of get better, get smarter, and learn and continue improving on this.
Thanks, Jess. Pulling out a couple of themes there. So right sizing was mentioned a few times. I think that's an excellent kind of perspective, especially around the issues of access. So financing might be improving, as some of our data showed, but how is it actually reaching the populations that have traditionally been underserved by this source of financing? And then the scale. How do we scale, and at what time increments also? And excellent to learn about your kind of multiple approaches beyond grant making. That's something that CDP is also kind of actively trying to bring into our work beyond grant making, but influencing, convening, and having that shared conversation with funders. So thank you so much, Jess. We'll come back to you, of course, for more in a few minutes. But over to you, Scott. Mercy Corps has a long history of working in anticipatory action and a strategic focus on climate innovation. What have you observed about how to best bring funders into this work of climate innovation?
Thanks, Sharad. Yeah, I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. And yeah, to your question, I think the best way to bring funders into anticipatory action is to demonstrate a clear pathway for moving from early risk taking to measurable impact and eventually toward longer term scale and impact. So building off of what Jess was describing there, how do we move from pilots to scale? So at Mercy Corps, our anticipatory action transfer work has been uh, involved with pastoralist communities in Kenya for several years, and I think this is a good example of how we move from pilot to scale. So we started this work in 2023. Coinbase provided some seed funding for a pilot with Fortune Credit, which is a local microfinance institution there. And we found two technology partners, Shamba Network and Diva Technologies, to work with us on designing a pilot that was using smart contracts to deliver cash before drought and before those drought conditions became more critical. So it instantly and importantly reduced the transfer costs by over 75%, and it reduced the settlement time to receive those cash transfers by 90%, so less than a day. And those early results really helped us build confidence in the model. And so Mercy Corps and Fortune Credit together, we worked to expand that work, and that traction through that pilot brought in Ripple as a new funding partner for a larger campaign last year. The expanded model, we tested Ripple's RLUSD stablecoin and a more sophisticated multi-checkpoint payout design. And the results, again, improved. So settlement times fell to under 6 hours. The share of participants were eating 3 meals a day increased from 13% to 77%. And participant trust, most importantly, was also very strong. We had a net promoter score of 82 on this work. And that partnership has continued to grow. So Fortune Credit has now partnered with one of our portfolio companies called Atram that's focused on climate risk modeling and insurance. So now they're exploring and expanding how they work with anticipatory payments across both philanthropic and insurance-based models. So really just a concrete example of how a small, well-evidenced pilot can develop into a multi-funder, multi-partner ecosystem over time. And from this, I think there's a few broader lessons for philanthropy. So first, invest in learning, invest in evidence and innovation. If the continued testing and evaluation helps us understand what works, where it works, and what needs to improve. Even relatively small investments in evidence can strengthen those decisions across the sector. So it can help organizations like ours and our partners attract more funding and help scale the strongest solutions over time. Second, and I think this echoes some of the points Jess was making, is it's important to center on local leadership and solutions. So communities understand their own risks, their own priorities, and coping strategies better than anyone. The strongest anticipatory action models are built with local communities and shaped by their experience and needs. And then third, support action while risks are becoming predictable and people still have choices. So before a crisis escalates, how can we invest in things like forecast-based triggers, early warning systems, locally defined risk indicators that can turn all of that information into timely action so that families can protect their food, their livestock, their income, and other essential assets. So, finally, I think making the funding flexible and long term is also just crucial to getting this right. Communities are facing recurring and overlapping shocks, and they need more systems that can anticipate that risk, models that can adapt as conditions change, and systems that can respond repeatedly over time. And flexible funding is essentially what gives organizations and communities the room to refine these solutions, adapt them to the local contexts, and scale what works.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for that summary. Kind of things that really came out to me were the notion of the smart investment, really looking at that kind of ecosystem of actors that you can bring together for these solutions and how important trust is, and really lifting up kind of local stakeholders and helping them kind of move forward with their own kind of journeys to kind of disaster response and recovery. Thank you so much, Scott. Greg, over to you. OCHA has been a leader across the UN system in pushing for greater anticipatory action and has led the preparation of anticipatory action plans involving multiple agencies in over 30 countries. So why has OCHA been pursuing this shift, in particular for addressing climate hazards? What resonates, what have you seen that resonates with governments, international organizations, and humanitarian agencies in shifting towards more anticipatory approaches?
Okay, thanks, Sharad, for that question. It's a pleasure to be here. In terms of why OCHA and through its partnerships, OCHA and the broader humanitarian system have been pursuing this shift to anticipation, I would just underline three things. One is that the technology now enables it much more than it had in the past. I mean, there have been great advances in climate analytics and weather forecasting that allow us to, and linking that actually to impacts that allows us to predict impacts much better than the past. If you look at this El Nino episode now that we're entering compared to previous El Nino episodes, we have better, earlier, more granular forecasting available. Of course, that means there's a challenge for us to build more effective partnerships between humanitarian actors and climate and weather science providers to take advantage of those advances. But those advances are there, and they've widened the window of opportunity between early warning and early action. And precisely the point is to take advantage of that window. So that would be my first observation. Secondly, the evidence supports it. I mean, this is not an entirely new endeavor in the humanitarian sphere. We've been pursuing anticipatory approaches for well over a decade now. And there's a growing and quite persuasive body of evidence that when we're able to take advantage of those early warnings, pre-positioned finance, you'll see here some of the key aspects of the anticipatory approaches that OCHA pursues using its pooled funding instruments, pre-agree triggers, the pre-agree activities, pre-positioned finance, that when we're able to pursue those approaches, outcomes are better for people in the short and medium term. And then thirdly, I would say that communities themselves demand it. I mean, when you ask people who are beneficiaries of humanitarian assistance what their priorities are, whether they would prefer to receive assistance before or after a disaster strikes, you won't be surprised to hear people know that their own options are maximized when we're able to reach and assist them before. And of course, to the extent that they're able to also themselves participate in that planning. So for those reasons, this shift is imperative for us, and we need to take it to a much bigger scale, as Scott mentioned. What resonates? Evidence, which Scott and Jess also mentioned. I mentioned that there's a growing body, but we still need to build on that and invest more, not just on the evidence of the short-term outcomes of humanitarian operations that are improved by acting early, but also the longer-term social and macroeconomic benefits in terms of avoided loss of acting in an anticipatory way. So that resonates both with communities, obviously, but with financing partners, with IFIs, et cetera. We need to build that evidence base. A second thing that resonates is linking what are often quite small scale or local humanitarian interventions to larger systems and working with governments to build their own anticipatory approaches using social protection and other tools available to governments. We've seen some interesting developments in legal frameworks, for example, in the Philippines. We've seen some very promising government uptake of anticipatory approaches, including recent announcements in Nigeria, building on smaller pilots in the humanitarian sector. So linking the discrete humanitarian interventions to bigger government-led systems also resonates and opens the door to different kinds of partnerships. And then a final point on what resonates, I would say, and I would say this from the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, is coordination. I mean, to the extent that we're successful in building a bigger body of humanitarian actors that are pursuing anticipatory approaches, that can either be a force for further kind of fragmentation in the humanitarian system if partners are using different frameworks, different forecasts, different triggers, et cetera, or it can be a force for greater coherence. We can harness it towards greater coherence and greater coordination. And of course, what resonates among all of our partners is when there is a better coordinated, more coherent approach within the humanitarian sector. And so the move to anticipation is also an opportunity to accelerate that.
Thanks, Greg. Really appreciate that. And thanks also for lifting up again the importance of evidence, kind of connecting localized solutions to more scaled potential solutions. And then just the point about, dignity, if we can support populations before disaster hits, that's a much more effective and responsible way of addressing their needs. So thank you for that. Now, kind of moving more towards the community level and locally led adaptation. So, communities on the front lines of climate disruption are already developing adaptive strategies, as we've already talked a little bit about here, and resilience innovations in response to what they see regularly, which is increasing risk. The challenge for philanthropy now is how to recognize, support, and scale these efforts as early as possible. So, Scott, Mercy Corps invests in technology and innovation for climate resilience. What types of innovations are emerging from communities themselves, and what are you observing about how to take pilots to scale? So, continuing some of these conversations that we've already started. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, we're seeing some of the most promising climate resilience innovations emerge directly from the communities we work with. And they're often taking emerging technologies like Greg was talking about, like climate analytics, like AI weather modeling, and adapting and tailoring these practical tools to the dynamics and needs of their communities. I can share a few examples, and I think the common thread is really the combination of local knowledge, trusted networks for distribution, and then practical tools and technologies like AI and climate analytics that are helping people act earlier and make better decisions. So first in Myanmar, our teams are working with several communities that developed a 7-channel communication system to reach villages with limited internet access. So they've had to use boat delivery, loudspeakers, door-to-door outreach, but all supported by AI-driven flood forecasts. So they're able to now respond faster or actually in an anticipatory way to flood. And as a result, 74% of households took action to prepare before the flooding occurred. So that had tremendous impact. Across the globe in Colombia, we have a Resi Red initiative that's working entirely through community action boards. And the community members there monitor and interpret information from several different weather sources. This strengthens their ability to analyze that data at the local level and then also anticipate climate risk. And the program uses an AI-enabled chatbot to provide locally relevant information on preparedness and really helps prevent a lot of the negative impacts from climate shocks. And then we're working across Latin America now with diaspora families that are using existing remittance networks in anticipatory ways as well. So families will they'll receive alerts ahead of different weather events like hurricanes, and they'll be able to send their money earlier, which gives their relatives time to purchase food and essential supplies or cover the cost of evacuating. The last example, actually, I'll just go back to the one I described earlier in Kenya's drylands. So Mercy Corps Ventures, we piloted an anticipatory action model that combines satellite monitoring with automated cash transfers. And the system is now so robust that it delivers support before drought conditions reach critical levels. So families are able to protect their livestock, purchase livestock feed, but also fortify their households and get ready for a long, enduring drought. In some cases, their consecutive years of drought. So these are examples of how, it's important to take pilots to scale. And once you do incorporate kind of these practical technologies and tools in ways that local communities are really adapting them and tailoring them to their own needs. So beginning with a problem that communities themselves have identified, and then tapping into local institutions and networks wherever possible that people already trust. That gives you the distribution and the buy-in from the local communities. And then importantly, through testing and generating evidence over time, that helps improve the model. It gives funders and partners confidence to participate. So it's really that combination of technology, distribution, partnerships, and financing in order to reach more people. So yeah, maybe I'll pause there. Hand it back
Thanks,
over to you.
Scott.
Yeah.
Excellent examples. Really appreciate you sharing them and really appreciated the kind of like cycle of continuous iteration and building on what are kind of practices that are accessible to the communities that we're working with. So thank you. Jess, what does it look like to fund locally led adaptation? What grant-making approaches is the ClimateWorks Foundation applying as a model for how philanthropy should work in this space?
Yeah, a lot to say here. I think, we're still early in our grant making. We launched the Adaptation and Resilience Fund last year alongside our partners at Howden Foundation, Loudis, Quadrature, and Rockefeller Foundation. And through the ANR Fund, our core goal is to accelerate solutions that build resilience in low and middle income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. And we have an initial focus on extreme heat, and then further kind of on informal workers and settlements. And one of our core goals was really to get resources and decision making closer to local communities. And in thinking through kind of how to get closer and how to surface these new implementers and, or sorry, new to us implementers, existing implementers, innovative ideas and kind of support locally led solutions. Our first kind of big bet was really to conduct two open requests for proposals focused on extreme heat in cities. And RFPs are a bit kind of not common, I guess, in philanthropy. And it was an intentional in our kind of way to surface these implementers and innovative ideas that was beyond our usual networks. And there was an explicit focus on cities, to ensure the proposals we received were grounded in kind of community specific geographies and solutions. And it also was focused on coalitions and consortia, and the groups that came together to submit the proposals really represented some really exciting partnerships, across kind of government entities, community-led organizations, folks that were previously focused on climate, folks that have just been focused on kind of community programs, maybe not climate related at all, technical expertise, and other partners. And, the project ideas they brought to us, were incredibly strong and really grounded in both the networks with local community, the institutions that could make this change kind of longer lasting, and, felt to us kind of more than one organization alone could provide. And so it was kind of an intentional strategic choice to focus both to do the RFP process itself and to focus on an underfunded hazard like extreme heat, and underfunded area like urban areas or informal settlements that have been a little bit of a historic blind spot for the philanthropic ecosystem. And then maybe just two other things. And so we also run the Adaptation and Resilience Collaborative for Funders, or ARC, and we're also embarking on a learning agenda there. And we're actually looking to better answer that question specifically. So, what does it look like to fund locally led adaptation well? What are the best practices? This isn't new. So, what do we know that's working? And also, how as philanthropy do we grapple with the tensions between the importance of locally led work and solutions and, the importance of scale and reaching more people? So happy to kind of share our learnings as we move through the process, but we're, really kind of modeling some of the locally led adaptation principles and our early learnings in our early grant making at the fund, with more flexible funding, longer term grants, less prescriptive, but kind of more locally determined. So we're tackling a problem, a concept, kind of the how, the where, the what is determined more kind of close to the issue at hand. And we're also looking at what local M&E means, so helping communities define what success means and how it's measured, and how can that help kind of inform our, what we're measuring on KPIs, but be less prescriptive for what they need to be measuring themselves. And so how can we make this a two-way conversation? And we're really excited to kind of learn both from the kind of early investments we've made and our partners and grantees, as well as through the peer network and ARC, and kind of continue to hone this question to come up with, some principles and guidance for both, how you're ensure you're really kind of getting and to that local level and supporting locally led solutions, as well as how we grapple with the tensions and kind of that need for scale.
Great. Thank you, Jess. Appreciate that rich response. Greg, so OCHA has been a leader across the UN system in pushing for greater anticipatory action. Oh, sorry, Mary asked that question. Sorry.
I think, yeah.
OCHA is working to pull in governments, NGOs, local disaster management authorities, and through this amazing OCHA UNDP Connecting Business Initiative, business networks, and private sector actors in this realm of anticipatory action and finance initiatives. What's working well in the same question of support to locally led climate adaptation action in different regions? What are you seeing as the challenges and the changes that philanthropy should be considering to help address these issues?
Okay, thanks for that. Did I turn my microphone back on? Yes, I did. Thank you for that. Well, I mean, what's working well? I mentioned that OCHA manages pooled funding instruments. We'll manage about $5 billion of those this year at the global level, and then at the country and regional level. And we know we have a huge task within the humanitarian system, not just to get ahead of emergencies and act in an anticipatory way, but also to provide life-saving and assistance in a way that builds people's resilience towards future disasters. And we've created a mechanism within the Central Emergency Response Fund called the SURF Climate Action Account, which is aimed at doing both of those things. And we set up a dedicated learning stream with our UN, and particularly when it comes to country-based pooled funds, local partners that we're able to fund directly to try to capture some of that learning around what works. You won't be surprised to hear, and I won't go into it in detail because Scott and Jess have both emphasized this, but it really is the local grounding and local leadership that delivers the best results. We've been trying to provide as much funding as possible directly to women-led organizations. We've been aiming to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the strategies. When it comes to local leadership, it's not just about delivery, but also shaping and decision making. So, I mean, they sound like truisms, but they really are the most important ingredient in programs or interventions that not just have an immediate impact, but also will last. I mean, it's the local communities that will be there, not just through this climate-related disaster, but the following as these escalate. And so we can't afford to treat these as one-off emergencies. It's an escalating context of emergency, and that means empowering local communities to themselves lead. So this is the key point. In terms of what philanthropy can do, one point I noted down is risk taking. I know it's tough for us all to manage, but it's also a truism, but equally true that communities that are in the greatest, that are most exposed and most vulnerable are the furthest behind, and where traditional forms of climate and development finance have found the greatest struggle to reach. And so we need philanthropy to accompany us in that journey of trying to reach the more difficult places. That involves longer term investment, that involves risk taking, that involves different kinds of partnerships. So if we can work together to find ways to enhance that, that's critical for us. Patience is another one. These are not solutions that are delivered from one day to the next. As I mentioned, this is we're in the context of what will be a long-term, indefinite struggle to build resilience in the face of these emergencies. And so equally, the investments need to reflect that patience. They need to be flexible, multi-year, and in that way, they can also, philanthropy's got a unique added value in that it's able to do that in ways that traditional forms of humanitarian assistance are not. So there's room for a complementarity there that I think is underexplored, particularly in the most difficult contexts. Local leadership, we've been through it. I won't stress it again. But then the point about building connections to other and different kinds of actors, including private sector, and you mentioned the Connecting Business Initiative, which is critical for us. We've begun with partners to see how we can connect local businesses better into anticipatory approaches, not just through a traditional kind of financing or in kind, but also in helping, in leveraging the assets and the capacities that exist there, but also the data and insights that businesses have about the communities that in which they're embedded, not just large scale multinationals, I mean also small local businesses. And so there's also an opportunity for philanthropy to support, those connections and that integration to be more effective for us.
Thanks, Greg. And yeah, many of the principles that you've been talking about applying to funding for climate-informed solutions also just apply to good philanthropic practice in general. So kind of those principles are very, very present. Thank you, Greg. We have about 19 or 20 minutes left in our conversation today. So panelists, I might curtail a little bit of this last section of our conversation so we have a little bit of time for Q&A. Scott, I'll come to you. As climate disruptions become more frequent and interconnected, philanthropy must adapt. This is our kind of theme, our underlying theme of this conversation today. We must consider what key messages and methods are that can be used to diversify how philanthropy deploys resources and who sees climate as part of their portfolio. And so at Mercy Corps, you're applying different fund climate initiatives, including grants, impact investments. What is the role of a venture-based approach specifically? And what are the different levels, including and maybe going beyond funding, that you're now applying to grow and scale climate innovation? So these kind of different approaches that we might consider through your work.
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, we use multiple models because climate innovations need different kinds of support at different stages. And so we work across that full spectrum. Grants can help test and de-risk an idea or an early stage model. The pilot funding that we were describing earlier can, help establish what works, where it works, what needs to improve. We find that technical assistance is absolutely critical. It can strengthen the team or the technology or the business model, or help kind of get that evidence of impact that's so necessary to grow it. And then impact investing. That's where we can help promising solutions grow, become more financially durable and attract additional capital. So, I think that's what we're most excited about with our venture-based approach. It's especially valuable when an early stage solution has the potential to reach many more people through that scalable, durable business model, but it needs some of that early stage support. And capital is crucial, but on its own is not enough. You need to provide partnerships and technical assistance and a range of strategies for proving out the impact and scaling it. And to give you a sense, we've been doing this for over 10 years now. We've invested in over 70 companies that are impacting now 62 million people. So it's just a really massive scale across, over 130 countries, including some of the most climate vulnerable countries. And philanthropy has played a key role in the technical assistance and some of that early piloting. And it's helped catalyze a great deal more capital into these same solutions. So over 85%, 83% of our portfolio companies have now raised follow-on rounds of financing that I think have totaled now nearly $800 million. So it really harnesses the capital markets, steers capital toward these climate adaptation and resilience solutions so they can scale. And really just want to emphasize this how important funders coming in to provide funding for technical assistance is that can help refine these models and measure impact and build partnerships along the way. Yeah, maybe I'll keep it there because I know we're trying to move on. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, before we get to Q&A, Jess, I'll come back to you. So as Scott mentioned, catalytic capital, absolutely important. But you've also mentioned that addressing the climate crisis will not just take shifts in how funders move money, but new ways and modes of working. So can you say a little bit more about that? What notable differences in terms of what you've seen in terms of who is or isn't self-described as a climate funder? How do you grow interest among funders who might not see themselves as climate funders?
Yeah, happy to take that. Let me think of how to be brief. I think, growing interest among funders who might not see themselves as climate funders is kind of a little bit my raison d'etre. That's a lot of what I do through ARC. And I think the core message, and I think there's different avenues in, but I think the core message is that everything needs to be climate informed now, funding included, and given the climate reality we live in. And our grantees, be it ecosystems or communities, are experiencing compounding threats, and climate's only intensifying those. And so to be responsive, and those realities, we need to think about our investments and how we can help prepare grantees and our focal, priorities to withstand these shocks, not just in the short term or a disaster, but more in the longer term. And I think, through our work on the foundation funding for adaptation and resilience, which you shared at the top, we've seen funding has grown substantially in recent years. And, but beyond the dollar amount, I think one thing that is really just is my favorite number in the survey is actually the number and types of foundations funding adaptation is also growing. So between 2021 and 2024, the number of adaptation or foundations giving to adaptation informed causes increased 55%. So we're seeing both a growth in interest as well as investment. And across ARC, that whole collaborative is really just moving beyond any kind of climate versus non-climate. It can be mitigation funders who are expanding to include adaptation, foundations with a focus on food or health or labor that are seeing how climate is impacting their grantees and thinking about how to add a climate lens onto their work. And that's a lot of what we do is kind of what are the struggles, what are the challenges? There's commonalities across all of us, and providing the space and creating core resources to kind of help enable funders to kind of do more and incorporate it. It's really like we don't need anyone to identify as a climate funder or even an adaptation funder. It's just that they're kind of changing the way in which they're giving. They're changing the approach, what they're considering, and they're looking at, how climate is impacting whatever their core goal is. So your goal can still stay the same. It's just how is climate impacting that, and how can we invest differently to ensure, the longevity and success of that. And then in terms of modality, I would say the A&R fund is kind of one of the fun things that came out of the ARC collaborative. It was a bunch of different funders, kind of had very diverse foci. And so we formed a pooled fund where, priorities, decision making, measurement, reporting, and impacts are all streamlined. And we're seeing philanthropies recognize that we need to do more, better, especially on newer topics like adaptation and resilience, and where we don't have maybe as much experience investing, and doing it together can help our own learning inform kind of our work together, as well as inform our own kind of portfolios as well. And so I think a lot of that partnership and kind of doing together is really kind of important in this space at this moment. I'll pause there.
Great, thank you so much for that. So now we can go to our Q&A. We received dozens of questions before the webinar, many of which have already been incorporated into the questions that we've been asking our panelists. So a few to kind of kick off with in the time that we have left. Maybe the first one for Greg. Over the past several weeks, we've seen extreme heat impacting much of Europe and the US. Extreme heat is a hazard that often does not get much attention from philanthropy, as Jess had mentioned before. I know you have specific expertise in heat resilience. How are you advising funders to incorporate hazards like extreme heat into their strategies?
Okay, well, expertise is a bit of a powerful word, but I'll do what I can. Well, first of all, just about the nature of the problem and its scale. I mean, just about everywhere that the data is good enough, extreme heat is the deadliest, quote unquote, natural disaster in terms of human mortality and morbidity. So the key thing I think to understand from humanitarian perspective, but then also from of a philanthropy perspective, is its unequal impacts. I mean, the phrase thermal inequality is one that is a powerful one, and it explains basically the situation, which is that in a heat wave or an extreme heat episode, the people who have the assets and the capacities to protect themselves do so. Those that don't are pushed right to the front lines. So the elderly, people who have chronic diseases, pregnant and breastfeeding women, people who have occupational vulnerabilities, agricultural workers, industrial workers, etc. So extreme heat really accelerates existing inequalities, and it can lead to absolutely devastating impacts in terms of mortality and morbidity. So from a humanitarian perspective, the important thing for us to understand is this is not an emergency like the other emergencies that the humanitarian system was set up to respond to. A heat wave doesn't kill everybody on one block. It kills one person on each block. And as we were emphasizing earlier, in light of the climate crisis, it's not a one-off emergency. These are accelerating. This is the most climate change correlated emergency that science will tell you that. And so what it requires is, again, as we were saying, a response that's really embedded in local communities, because it's the local communities and local actors that understand who the most vulnerable people are. We're not going to be able to respond to these heat emergencies by rushing, large-scale food assistance across the world. It has to be a bottom-up approach that's embedded, and it has to also recognize that while yes, emergency response is important, what's more important are the investments to build people's longer-term resilience to extreme heat. We're going to be living with this for the rest of our lifetimes, no matter what happens in climate mitigation in the coming decade. And so those kinds of patient longer-term investments and that evidence also that I mentioned. I mean, there is good evidence that targeted investments in heat health action plans, for example, can pay real dividends. So I do see a big role for philanthropy in helping to meet that challenge. And again, in helping us to bring together a kind of complementary approach that combines, yes, emergency response, but also smart longer-term resilience investments.
Thanks, Greg. Really appreciate that. So we have a number of questions in our chat, in our Q&A box. One question in particular that I'll ask, and maybe for Scott or Jess, who would ever like to answer this. We often hear that technological solutions like direct cash payment distribution platforms come with an added need for technical assistance to onboard communities, and that kind of reflects some of the conversation we had earlier around right sizing, access, technical assistance provision that accompanies the financing. Philanthropic funders have expressed concern over adding a burden to communities. We're wondering what you might say about that response, that concern. What are the best practices for stewarding new technologies to solve for getting money to the front lines?
Well, I'm happy to start us off, and then I'd be
Great,
curious
thanks.
about Jess's thoughts on this as well. So I think where we're always intentional is in identifying tools and technologies that are community-led or embraced, where there is that trust or there is a potential to develop and integrate those solutions into how institutions function, how the business environment operates, and how people interact within different communities. And so trying to kind of avoid some of those challenges that I think the question alludes to. Getting products and services and information to the last mile can be incredibly difficult, and that's where having strong partnerships with local actors is crucial. So in the examples I was describing earlier, every single initiative has a local organization that's been building trust for years, if not decades, and we're then integrating emerging technologies or tools in a very practical way into how they're already relating to their customers or their clients or their community members. So one example of that was that microfinance institution that I mentioned. We started actually incorporating blockchain-based stablecoins into how they were sending and receiving payments. And the users on the front end had no idea what the piping on the back end was doing, but it did help reduce costs very substantially and helped speed up getting cash into their mobile wallets. And then we needed to solve the challenge of like, how do we off-ramp digital cash into tangible cash at the last mile? And so having that local partner on the ground that had banking outlets and ATMs and so forth was just so crucial. So yeah, that would be just kind of one anecdotal kind of response to that question.
Great. And then, yeah, Jess, if you want to come in for maybe 30 seconds and then we can go to a lightning
Sure.
round before we wrap up. Thank you.
I mean, I would say I think a lot of our work is focused on the opposite, that we think that the technical assistance is quite crucial. And I think, so through our grant making, that's what we practice. And then I would say through our work with the funder community, it's kind of onboarding people to the kind of needs and necessities of these and really to kind of create a shared importance on the value there. And so that's kind of the way in which we think about it.
Great, thank you. So quick lightning round before we wrap up. So maybe in 3 to 5 words, maximum 10 words. What is one system bottleneck or technological breakthrough you would like to see resolved? And we can kick it off with whoever is ready to go first.
Well, one that comes to mind for me, the bottleneck that I think would be really impactful to solve would be access to affordable, reliable, locally relevant climate data. So there's so many, vulnerable regions that still lack weather stations and public data sets and last mile connectivity to turn what's increasingly, powerful tools that we have with AI and satellite imagery into, decision-making tools. And so having kind of open climate data infrastructure that combines a lot of these emerging remote sensing tools and local observations and community knowledge, I think that would be really filling a big gap that we see in a lot of climate vulnerable communities out there.
Thanks, Scott. Jess, Greg, no pressure, but if you have one.
I mean, I could share a couple quick thoughts. So technological side, I think impact-based forecasts are an area that we really need that have great potential to really improve our work. That's essentially going from what the weather will be to what the weather will do. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, the potential of AI applications to that is really promising, and we've already seen some important dividends for that. But there's a lot left to be done there. So that would be one area in terms of predictive analytics. And then bottlenecks. I mean, there's so many; it's hard to choose one. But I would just highlight again the yawning gap in climate finance and climate action in the most fragile, particularly in like fragile conflict-affected contexts, where these people who are really on the front lines of the climate crisis are often people who are already experiencing humanitarian needs. And so we need to build the evidence and also the kind of mechanisms within the finance architecture that can actually reach the places that are not currently being reached. And I think philanthropy can help kind of demonstrate what's possible and what can work, what's not working now.
Jess, last word to you.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm thinking of a systemic bottleneck or a systemic area where I think things could improve. And maybe reflecting back to my first question on London Climate Action Week, I think that there obviously is a lot of challenges within the available finance right now. And I think there's a lot of different actors that have different sources, that have different timelines, different requirements. And so how can, we work together better to understand each other's requirements, make that a little bit more smooth, and kind of really ensure that it is easier to access the capital that's needed both for the pilot phase, but kind of continue on and to scale up those projects.
Wonderful, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for our discussion today, and so many questions, rich questions that we couldn't get to. So yeah, thank you to our panel for the great discussion. A few takeaways before we wrap up. So climate change modifies the landscape, as we've been hearing. It affects not only the frequency and severity of disasters, but the role philanthropy can play. Many communities are navigating overlapping, recurring, and prolonged crises, making it increasingly important for philanthropy to move beyond a response and recovery mindset, really taking on more anticipatory approaches. The tools to act earlier already exist. We've heard some amazing examples of tools, mechanisms, pilots that are already working effectively. From local knowledge to climate forecasting and anticipatory financing, funders can choose different approaches to engage with before disaster strike. And as we heard from our panelists, every funder can become climate informed. Climate informed philanthropy isn't only for climate focused foundations and funders. All funders can ask, how will climate affect the communities we support? Are our investments helping communities prepare for intensifying climate hazards? So a little bit about CDP. This webinar is just one of our many educational and knowledge offerings. We provide comprehensive disaster profiles, issue insights, covering US and international disaster issues, topics. Our expert advisory services team can partner with donors and funders who seek customized assistance with disaster giving strategies. Our coalition building work supports coordination and leadership to mobilize philanthropy, more action orientation on equitable disaster recovery. And beyond our expert resources, you can visit our website to learn more about our collaborative funds. And thank you to our promoters. This webinar has been promoted by a range of organizations, including Alliance Magazine, the Network for Engaged International Donors, Philanthropy Southeast, Giving Compass, and Philanthropy New York. Thanks to you all for helping us reach a broader audience. And thank you to Jess, Scott, and Greg for sharing their incredible insights and what their organizations are doing to address these ever-growing issues. If you have questions or thoughts that were not addressed today during today's webinar, you may email them to webinars@disasterphilanthropy.org. And it's just after 2 o'clock on the East Coast, so we'll wish you all an excellent rest of your day. Thank you for joining us, and take care. Bye-bye.